Hey there, welcome back. I've got an amazing story to share with you today. It's a little outside the scope of our podcast, which covers 19th century through early 20th century. But this one starts in the year 1738 and crosses over into the 1800s, so I guess we're covered. But you won't be sorry, because this is a really extraordinary story about a woman named Mary Dodd, who was a survivor of 2 American wars and lived to be 111 years old. Hi, this is Sarah, and you're listening to another episode on Ladies First, Not Really. As Americans, when we talk about the American Revolution, we always focus on the Loyalists were kind of the bad guys because they wanted England to still rule America. And we praise those that are the patriots. But because of that, we never talk about the Loyalist lives, what it was like for them, their viewpoint, and what happened to them after the war. I mean, do you know what happened to the Loyalists after the war? All we know is that Loyalists were tarred and feathered, and that was about it. This story covers that. It also covers the French and Indian War, which up to this point I did not know was a piece of the 7-Year War. I guess I missed that in history class. But it was really interesting to look at the big picture between these wars and the impact that it had to the territorial claims in the United States. So anyway, let's get to it. Today's lady is Mary Dodd, and this is her story. It was the year 1738. A British ship was sailing through the Bay of Biscay, which lies in the Atlantic Ocean between North America and Europe. The ship had a wooden hull, was destined for New York. Okay, so the ship, not like today's ship. Think of pirates. This large wooden hulled ship, huge mast. The waves were striking the hull as the ship rocked from side to side. A woman passenger lay in the lower deck giving birth to a baby girl. Okay, that in itself makes you want to cringe, because the conditions for passengers aboard 18th century ships were dark, they were unsanitary, and your real only comfort was a straw-filled mattress. It was very thin, no support, no toilets other than you could go to the bathroom in a chamber pot, which they then threw over the side of the ship. No AC, no bathing, and generally these ships take several months to get between Europe and North America. So this poor woman, who unfortunately we don't know her name, is laying there giving birth on a straw-filled mattress in these conditions. And imagine being in this position and the ship is rocking back and forth, the waves hitting the sides. I mean, those conditions are just horrendous in general. But the baby girl was born and she was fine, and her name would become Mary. Unfortunately, we don't know what happened to her mother. All we know is that she was born aboard the ship and arrived in New York as an orphan, because it's recorded that her father had died fighting a battle for King George, King of England, and we know nothing else of her mother, again, other than that she arrived in New York as an orphan. But once she got to New York, she was taken to St. Augustine, Florida, where she spent her childhood. She eventually married and settled down with her husband. His last name is Dodd, obviously, but we don't know the first name. And they settled down and built their home on the banks of the Alabama River. At this time, the Alabama River was part of the French territory. Alabama would not become a recognized state until 1819. So here she is living her life with her husband, unknown, unnamed, doing we're not sure what. But it's important to go back to what was happening in the political climate across the dominant countries at this time. America is not what America is today. This was prior to the Revolutionary War. It was prior to America's Declaration of Independence. So at this point in time, Britain owns a good portion of the United States, and the French owned a portion of it in the middle, being Louisiana. The Spaniards owned Florida at this time too, actually. So you had three dominant countries that owned what would become states in America. Okay, let's go back. So during the early to mid 1700s, the American colonies were owned by Britain, France, and Spain, as I mentioned. At this time, Florida, Mexico, and several bordering states were owned by Spain as well. The French owned Louisiana, Mississippi, and north into Canada. England owned the 13 East Coast colonies. At the time of Mary Dodd's married bliss on the Alabama River, contention had been brewing between England, France, and Spain. They all wanted territorial control. Shocker! In 1756, England declared war on France. In America, this war was called the French and Indian War, since it was a fight between England and French control of the North American territories. Now, in Europe, it eventually was called the Seven Years' War because Prussia and Spain were also at war with England and France over territorial control in Europe, and it obviously lasted 7 years. Now, when war was declared, Mary and many of the other British settlers that were living in Louisiana were taken prisoner by the French and taken to New Orleans. They remained there for 2 years before being transferred to Veracruz, Mexico, that was under Spanish control at the time. Mary continued to be a prisoner until the British invaded the Spanish territories in 1761. Now, her time there is unknown. We're not sure if she was confined to a specific building, if she just was stuck in the area. There's not much mentioned about that. But now she's free. The British has saved her again, and she is now free and was taken back up to New York. The war eventually ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763 and Britain's claim of victory. Now, during the French and Indian War, she was a prisoner for about 10 years between taken to New Orleans and the Veracruz. She was a prisoner for a solid decade. So after being a prisoner for that long, she and her husband tried to make a new life in New York. I mean, start all over. You're in a new territory. One, ironically, is where she started out with in the beginning, but they started to come back around and rebuild their lives. However, American independence was brewing even more now that England's gains over the Spanish and French territories had expanded. So in 1768, the Revolutionary War broke out. Mary and her husband were Britons, and they were loyalists to England and continued to be throughout the war. Her husband fought under the British through several battles, and she followed him through several of them, specifically White Plains in New York, Monmouth in New Jersey, and Yorktown in Virginia. It's not often discussed what life was like for the Loyalists during the war. They were threatened, assaulted, ostracized from social circles, and hid in the shadows out of fear. And of course, women in the 18th century had very limited rights as individuals already. If married, all their property belonged to their husband, and since they did not have political rights and weren't considered intelligent enough to have political opinions, let's just say that, they were assumed to align with their husband's political views, even if this wasn't the case. During the war, several of the Loyalist men would have escaped to England, and several wives stayed behind to take care of the estates while their husbands ran away. But this wasn't the case for Mary. Her husband fought, and she followed him through the different battles, which also is pretty common for Loyalist women because, again, they lived in fear of what would happen with them living at home. Their friends turned away from them, and tensions were very high. So they followed them through the battles. And a lot of the women did the cooking and cleaning and nursing for the soldiers while they were there. After the war ended in 1783, many Loyalists migrated to Canada. Mary eventually settled in New Brunswick in 1784 and lived there until her death in 1849. She was said to have lived until 111 years old, which would have put her birth at 1738, as mentioned. The Buffalo Courier Express in 1849 said that in the death of this aged person, there is a volume of history lost. Living in great retirement, the relic of a forgotten age, few know the stories she could tell of the brave old days. I could not agree more. What an incredible and rare insight into a woman's living through 2 wars, migrating, and living over a century later. She was clearly very determined and had great internal fortitude to go through all of that. To be born on a ship, raised as, I guess, an orphan or adopted, we don't know, in Florida, from New York to Florida, to Louisiana, then to Mexico, held captive for 10 years, back to New York, crossed the East Coast during the Revolutionary War, and eventually living the rest of her life in Canada. I wish we had more information on this lady because I could just love to read her journals and her memories of what it was like from a day to day perspective. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Ladies First, Not Really. Join us next week. For more information, visit my blog at rebelliouscorsets.com.